Your tech business is in a race to stay ahead of the competition. And you might be wondering if China could be your next move. But to work out whether China is the right opportunity, there are lots of things you'll need to know, from customs compliance to cybersecurity. To explore important questions like how to protect your intellectual property, how Chinese law might affect your business, and how to check the background of potential business partners, visit gov.uk/digital and tech China. See the potential, know the challenge.
Hello and welcome to the ultimate episode of Binging Bridgerton, our limited edition podcast about the Netflix series. With me today is my co-host Beth. Hi Beth.
Hello, episode 9. Woo!
And also our friend of very many years, Tanya. Welcome to the show, Tanya.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Tanya, you like to read romance novels, don't you? Like, you've read Bridgerton.
I have, yes. I actually read the first book in 2005. So I didn't get to them when they first came out, but I did read them pretty soon thereafter.
Just before we start, we've had people on this show who have read the books, who haven't read the books. As somebody who's read it way back when, were you surprised when you heard that Shonda was making an adaptation of this particular series?
I was delighted and thrilled and excited to see a romance series being adapted. But I was interested that she picked one not from the last 5-7 years.
Right. So for we've been talking about this with other people, but I feel like you and I probably read a lot more romance than anyone else has been on the show. And romance as a genre, it's evolved quite a bit since Bridgerton was written, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And we'll come to, a lot of things that have been said and written about this show. And the ignorance that that has been exhibited by various culture writers, that has been quite shocking to me. I feel like it shouldn't be shocking to me because we talk about this all the time in Romancelandia about how, as a genre, romance is really overlooked and ignored, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We're January right now. We're coming into February. I think Romancelandia is holding its breath and waiting for the terrible Valentine's Day takes that are going to come around again. And Bridgerton's going to be part of the fuel for that this year.
What are the terrible Valentine's takes? As someone who is very far outside Romancelandia and does not even really observe it particularly, tell me the drama.
Oh, there's always someone who decides that they're going to publish an article around Valentine's Day saying, here are the top 10 romance novels to read, and Lolita's on that list, and Anna Karenina is on that list, or they're all dead white dudes, right? Or there's I decided to read a romance novel because it's Valentine's Day, and here's why it was terrible.
It's just hot take after hot take after hot take, and you're just like, maybe you should just talk to somebody who actually likes the genre. Yeah, so I wanted to ask you, Tanya, what did you, since we're talking about hot takes, what did you think about a lot of the writing around this show? Not off the show, but the responses that have come from, media writers, so to speak.
Right, it was interesting to me because I actually started watching the show with some friends who had never read the Bridgertons, never read any romance novels. And so listening in on their conversations about it was fascinating. And then my parents started watching it, and that was also fascinating. My dad called me up and was like, why didn't you warn me? And I said, I didn't know you were watching. But what I've loved so much is the attention to the costuming, there's been so many great details about how much effort went into the costuming, how much effort went into creating the world. And I think, especially in a time where we're all stuck indoors, having that to focus on has been really, really lovely. I've so enjoyed learning about whether or not the costuming is entirely time period appropriate. But just learning about the detail and the work and the care that went into the program, I've loved that.
Right, because we don't usually see that around romance, do we? Like
No.
when we talk about like romance adaptations, usually it's something like a Debbie Macomber adaptation on Hallmark or something where, you know, like it's usually, you know, a woman goes back home to a hometown for Christmas, finds, you know, the love of her life,
Right.
the lumberjack or something, and it's made on a budget of maybe like $50,000. And over here you have this multi-million-dollar production with everything dialed up to 11, everybody just gorgeous, and you know, it's a proper production and it's been quite lovely.
One of the things that I really appreciate too is you're not getting the sense that these are repurposed costumes from a different production.
Right.
They were specifically built for this.
This is how low the bar is. Beth, you have, you know, you're like one of the people that just loves period adaptations, and you've watched. I know this about you because you and I usually watch it together. So I know that you've sat there and you've watched all the Austen ones, you've seen all the Bronte ones, and all the other ones in between. Tell me a little bit about your impressions about the way that they use music and the way that they use dance in the series.
I think they use the music very well. I was more aware of the music in a good way than I often am. The music as a social event is so important in this show. The fact that there's an actual musician who's a sort of a secondary character in Siena is really interesting to me, since we don't see them very often in the other period adaptations I'm aware of. The times we see the instrumentalists performing, there are people of different races who are performing, and there's women as well as men. And then, of course, the adaptations of current pop songs. I think, as I said in a previous episode, I didn't actually recognize the songs themselves, but I could tell they were happening. And I really like that touch. I think that's so clever to pull us now back into that and let the music speak to us in the same way as it does now, but just with different things kind of around it. And it reminds me of, you know, things like Clueless, where a Jane Austen novel is brought into the present day. So now we took the present day and put it back in the Regency, which was really fun. And it underscores how young some of these people are. Music is meaningful to these people as individuals, in addition to being meaningful as a societal sort of cultural act and statement about identity and things like that. So it's very lush, and I'm all for it.
The other thing that you've touched upon is the youth of the characters, which is something that I'm used to when I'm reading, but I always skip it over, you know, like it never quite registers in my mind that everyone is supposed to be like 18 and 25. In my mind, they're a little bit older because in our society, in the world that we live in, when people are having discussions about marriage and about children and about courtship, they tend to be a little older than 18 and 25, you know. And when we talk about like 18-year-olds thinking about like settling down, it's usually some sort of commentary about babies settling down and stuff. This is obviously not true of the time. Women were making their debuts at 17, 18, and were expected to settle down pretty quickly and have children within the first year of marriage. So this is a society that skews younger, that has like a lower life expectancy. I remember back in the day when Shekhar Kapoor was making Elizabeth, for instance, like one of the things that he said was that there's a youth and an urgency to the lives that these people lead because the life expectancy was basically 30 years old or something at the time. Now, things are a little bit better in Regency England, but not as much as, say, it would be in the 21st century. Tanya, were you taken aback by the youth of these characters, or were you able to just take it in your stride?
I think one of the things that struck me was that in the book, Daphne's on her third season, I believe. It's not her first season. So that's also a different piece of it, too. She's on her third season. She's starting to feel a little bit desperate. She wants to get married. She wants to have a large family. And so that also drives part of her story. Versus, she's in her first season. She's been deemed flawless. And now that adds a different pressure to her story. So that was something that was a disjunct for me. That was something that threw me off a little bit.
Right. And I think, Beth and I have talked about this before, about how Daphne, because Beth was confused about why Daphne looks one way and behaves another, like what is happening. But in the book, she is basically everyone's kid sister, and nobody takes her seriously as a sexual person.
Right.
Because everyone is just invested in her being Antony's kid sister.
Right, and she's witty and droll and has this great sense of humor, and you see that on the page.
That's not in the show.
Right. But there's this great moment when she's married Simon, they've moved into Cliveden, and she's dealing with the housekeeper, and she has all of these questions. And I love how she's walking through and she's saying, my mother has suggested I do this. My mother has suggested I do this. And you can see that she doesn't know.
Right.
And I think that was a great touch.
And also, just before that scene, she sees a portrait of Simon's mother, and she's taken aback. And that is actually, when we see Simon's mother before, it's when she's dying in childbirth, and those are all the flashbacks.
Right.
So the portrait is actually the first time that we see her presented to the world the way that perhaps she might have wished to be seen. And she's a gorgeous woman, just beautifully dressed and regal. And Daphne is very much the opposite of the woman in that portrait, because it's a grand portrait and this woman is dressed in silks and in brocade, and then Daphne is in her period appropriate muslin, and it's just a slip of a girl, and she's looking up at this portrait, and the housekeeper makes it a point to say that she's the perfect duchess. I want to just touch on this idea of perfection, because all throughout the series we see it coming back to that. There's this thing about the Bridgertons being a perfect family because they had something that a lot of people in the town don't have, which is like two parents that loved each other. And they, in the very first episode, you see when Simon is invited to the family dinner, and he remarks upon the fact that, they're all together at the table and interacting, even the children. And Violet says, we are quite blessed in that we like each other. And of course then, comedy cue, and the kids are like fighting across the dinner table. But again and again it comes up, and even in the last episode, the fight between Antony and, or is it the second last episode? The fight between Antony and Simon, where they've come back to town, and Antony's trying to understand what went wrong between Simon and his sister. And they have this conversation in which they're just jabbing at each other. And Simon is jabbing at Antony for not being the perfect viscount and the perfect head of the family. Whereas Antony is jabbing at Simon for not being the perfect duke. And you see the tension that all these people have, where Eloise is thanking Daphne for being the perfect debutante and the perfect Bridgerton sister. And you have all these different angles on what perfection means to these people, and how important it is to these people to be not only seen as perfect, but to be perfect. And I was wondering if either of you have any thoughts. Beth, why don't you go first?
Hearing you say that, it makes me reflect upon the last episode in a slightly different way, because it's so emotionally important and narratively important that Daphne has that big speech about it's okay not to be perfect, people will love you anyway. So
Right.
that maybe stands in contrast to what you're saying a little bit. So maybe the show tried to take a slightly different approach with that, or at least allow for moments where that wasn't a priority.
I felt it was the other way around. It was that, in that point, both, like, Daphne understands the pressure of being seen as perfect or
yes.
having to pretend to be perfect.
Yes, definitely.
And so she creates a safe space for her and for Simon to be imperfect and himself.
And I also think that Eloise does a pretty good job of giving Penelope some of that. She doesn't know why Penelope is as upset as she is, right, in some of those scenes, and she doesn't know who Lady Whistledown is. But when Penelope comes to Eloise, in utter tears over what's happened with Marina, or when she's mourning her father, I think that we've been hard on Eloise a lot in our podcast because she's so irritating, but she is, to the extent that her knowledge allows, a good friend for Penelope, and allowing her friend to have emotions that are, unseemly or unpleasant or whatever. And she's not always great at it, and she is self-centered, especially in her quest to find Whistledown, but I think that they have a really nice friendship that allows for some of that too.
What about you, Tanya?
I was also thinking around the theme of perfection that, we get to see Simon and Daphne being painted, like their portrait is being done, and the creation of perfect, and how the portraitist, was his name Granville?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How Granville has to sort of set the stage for them and direct them, and eventually says, oh, what a perfect portrait of devotion, the image of devotion, even though we know that they're in this incredibly tense moment. So that creation of a document that will outlast, which I felt like was a really interesting parallel then to the portrait of the Duchess, Simon's mother, and that image of perfection that is hanging over Daphne, and now she's in the process of creating her own portrait of perfection. I believe in one of your earlier episodes, you'd also talked about how this is a society that hinges on observing each other. And not just that they're looking out and they're watching and they're reading the scandal sheets, but then they're also involved in the production of these portraits to cement and create something that will outlast them. I mean, the scandal sheets are going to disappear, right? They're going to get burned at the end of the week or day, but the portraits will last. So that investment in creating the image is also really interesting.
Thinking about our pop songs are in their show, our image obsession and self-image obsession is there in their world as well, and vice versa, that the artificiality of the social events, the performative nature of that. And I think we see it maybe most of all in the Queen, who has these outrageous wigs and headpieces, and she's the most visually dramatic. And we see in a few small moments the imperfection of her actual emotional life and family life. These clothes and all stand in maybe contrast to and maybe try to shield. We don't get to see the Queen's emotional life very much, but one wonders what she's trying to project in how she chooses to present herself.
Right. So talking about the Queen and, the way that one chooses to project oneself, let's talk about how women function in this society. Because we have so many amazing examples of the way that gender plays into the way that these people live their lives, from the Whisper networks to Lady Danbury's Married Women Club, and also how working class women, from the maids and the housekeepers to people like Genevieve and Sienna, and Eloise and her ambitions. Tanya, did you have any thoughts about how gender is portrayed in the series?
I do. I think we spend most of our time with the women in this series. We do cut away, and I'm so happy that we see Simon with an actual non-Bridgerton friend. I think that's a really important choice. But we spend so much time with the women, but we also see them checking each other out, gauging what the social lines are. And it's nice to see that moment where Lady Danbury invites Daphne into her posse of married women, into her club of married women. On the second viewing that, I was wondering who's excluded from that club, though. Who doesn't get the invitation and who does? I did see Lady Bridgerton there. I did see Mrs. Featherington there. So also just wondering who are the other women who are invited in and who isn't. I loved that moment between Daphne and Marina, where Daphne offers to write a letter to the Colonel to see if she can find Sir George Crane. And Marina doesn't believe anything will come of it. And Daphne says, "You don't know what I'm capable of." That's not her exact quote, but basically saying, I'm capable of doing more than you think I can. Let me do this for you.
Right.
But when she actually writes the letter, Marina's first question is, did the Duke sign it along with you?
Yeah.
And so there's this interesting moment where Daphne has full faith in her own abilities. And it might be because she hasn't really been tested yet. And then Marina, who's had this very different life experience, is saying, no, you don't have the power you think you do. I think the way that power is played with and cut and then pushed up against, they're making some really interesting choices in the show.
That's right. I mean, the way that Daphne and Marina meet in the 7th episode, like, it just sets up a completely different dynamic for the last 2 episodes that we haven't really seen in their interactions with any other character on the show prior to that. Because Daphne is, now that she's married, and also I feel like she's been taken under the wing of Lady Danbury, who to all intents and purposes is actually her mother-in-law. Mm-hmm. And is a very different woman from Violet Bridgerton. I mean, if Lady Danbury had a daughter and the daughter got married, she would 100% tell her daughter, like, what to expect in the marital bed. Whereas, Violet Bridgerton has this, where you kind of see the limitations of Violet Bridgerton as a character, because she has this faith that everything will work out, because things did work out for her. And to me, like, that reminds me of a lot of the speeches that Marina made when she first came to London, where she has such contempt for the upper classes, because she thinks of them as Violet Bridgerton is, in fact, as people who just expect the world to settle as they wish around themselves. And it's funny that she directs that speech towards Lady Featherington, who is not that person at all, and who, as we see throughout the series, works towards her goals and makes sacrifices for them, versus Violet Bridgerton, for whom it is true, like, things do fall in place for her. It's just, there's just so many little things that happen between all these people. The way that Will's wife takes Simon to task and tries to explain to him that he comes from a place of privilege, that, that he can't understand their life. And also the fact that Will and his wife are one of the few positive depictions of a happy, functional, married life that Simon witnesses. And it belongs to a different class than his own. Just tiny things like that.
I also believe that Lady Mrs. Featherington would absolutely give the real sex talk to her daughters.
Yeah.
Right? She would not hold back. One thing that did annoy me in their choices, when Sir Philip shows up and he's got the letter from Sir George, or the remnants of the letter for Marina, I have to say I was really mad at the show for not letting her just have that realization that she'd been loved, that he was planning to come back to her. They had to twist it into, I didn't believe him, I cast him as a villain, and now I have to live with that. And it just felt like a compounding of the tragedy that wasn't necessary.
It really bothered me that, I guess the previous episode when Colin and Marina have their final conversation, that Colin re-enters the room basically to say, and you know what? I would have stood by you if you'd just been truthful. Like, I understand why he wanted to say it, but she did not need to hear that at all. And I just, Colin is my favorite Bridgerton at this point, I think. And I was like, oh, low blow, man. You didn't need to do that. But I know you're young, and it's the kind of thing we hope as adults we would just keep to ourselves. But oh, it was so painful.
Yes, it was.
Beth, what is one of your favorite moments in the show?
Ooh. In terms of what a show can do, I would love to think back about the Vauxhall events and when that moment when all of the lights come on, the outdoor lights strung overhead, and you hear the kind of tinkling of glass or something like that, and everyone kind of goes, "Ooh." That felt so magical to me, partly just for the historical thinking about technology and things like that. And I don't know what it is that they're supposed to be doing exactly, technically speaking, but when you think about how rare it is to get to have bright light outdoors at night for these people, that was really interesting. But it also just, again, made me miss going to places and ready to get a wonderful, happy experience, which we haven't had in so long. But I thought that was something that you can do on film really well, that maybe, you can read it in a book and think it's wonderful, but then to actually see it happen is so charming. I really liked that. In terms of moments between people, one of the threads I have appreciated is the relationship between Colin and Daphne. I think they understand each other in some ways that other people don't. And for example, he's the one who actually listens to her and tries to get her help to go stop the duel. And he's the one who says, when she comes back to Bridgerton House after the disasters at Cliveden, he says, "What happened at Cliveden?" And no one else point blank really asks her. And maybe it's because of their similarities in age or something like that that makes them able to have conversations that other people can't have. And the fact that he doesn't have any actual power over her the way Anthony does. I really like that they sort of have a friendship in each other. And I wanted to see more of the Bridgerton siblings all together and get more of the sense of them as a family, because I really liked it. And I understand from what you're saying that it's important in the books. And the moments of it that we do get are great, but I wanted more. And I really like their pairing.
What about you, Tanya?
So I first started reading the books, again, in 2005. I was in Morocco, freshly graduated from college. It was my first job, and I was in a totally new country, totally new setting. And I discovered the Bridgerton books on someone's bookshelf.
Amazing.
It was great. I was like, this is the escapism I need. Everything is so uncertain. I was a teacher for 6th grade. I didn't have an education background. It was kind of a ridiculous job. I loved being in Morocco, but it was also really lonely. And one of the things that pulled me to the series was the closeness of the siblings. Even though they span, A through H, right, in terms of names. They're still a very close-knit family in the books, and very much trusting and supportive of one another, kind of implicitly. Anthony does not try to make decisions for Daphne. He tries to support her as best he can. Daphne and Colin are the closest in age, so they have a very close relationship. And that was one of those things I needed and I really sank into as I was reading the books. So I think one of my favorite scenes in the series is actually that scene where Colin is singing the round, but you've got the entire family back together, and they are so supportive of each other. That's the scene that felt like the closest family scene to the books. For what the choices this series has made, I love all the small, dark scenes between Eloise and Benedict.
Oh, yeah, those are
Those
great.
are so great. Which then culminates in that really awkward carriage scene where he goes to pick up Delacroix. But I think building that relationship was a really lovely choice that the show made.
Okay, you guys have like really lovely points, but I hate to lower the tone of the entire discussion. But one of the things that I really liked was the scene at Gunter's where the Duke licks the spoon. And I thought like that was a really clever choice because one, it's the Duke licking a spoon, and you are clearly meant to imagine him having oral sex, right? And you'd be like, oh, he's going to be good at oral sex. But the way that they do it is that they then focus on Daphne, and he's doing it entirely, like he's not doing it, with intent. Like he's not trying to seduce her at all in that scene. But you see her face, and she has this look on her face where she feels like she has seen something. She doesn't know what it is, but she has seen something. And I thought like that was like a really great character moment for Daphne. And at that point in the series, she really needed it. So that was great. And then another point that I really liked was, this the show does this thing that a lot of Shondaland shows do, which is they do a little compare and contrast or little callbacks to earlier scenes. So one of the scenes that really stood out to me was earlier in the series, you see Anthony and Daphne go down to the kitchen to warm up some milk.
Yeah.
And they literally can't figure out how to light the fire. And they're absolutely useless, and you get such a good idea of just what lives of enormous privilege these two must have led, where they don't even know how to light the fire in the kitchen.
Right. Can we also talk about how big the milk jugs are that they
Yeah.
get? It's not even glasses.
And both of them are swigging from it. I'm just like, who drinks that much milk? At least get a glass. You know how to get a glass, don't you? Anyway, totally disgusting. Anyway, but then later on in the 7th episode, you see Marina go into the kitchen, and she not only knows how to boil water, but she also knows how to make an abortion tea, which I'm just like, how do you know that, young lady? So what about your least favorite moments in the show, Beth?
I mean, that scene is number one, for sure. I 100% did not expect to see any kind of sexual assault within a married couple in this show, in most shows. It was horrendous, and Daphne is vile in that moment, and I know she grows as a human after that, but I still think she owes her husband a significant apology. The more important thing is that the show does not treat it with the seriousness that it merits, and that is upsetting. Standards of the day, whatever, but we are people making a show now and watching it now, and you can't just toss that in there and not criticize it. You have to criticize it. That was really upsetting. Trying to think if there are any other really bad moments or moments that didn't work for me. I really think, here's one thing. I don't know where I would have changed this, but I wanted more of the Featherington parents. Partly because Mr. Featherington, of course, meets with this horrible end, but we weren't really given time to invest in him particularly. And I'm wondering if there are a few scenes that got cut or something like that. And their relationship is really interesting, especially in retrospect, when Lady Featherington says, when Marina asks her, how do you stay married for so long when you didn't love them to start with? And she talks about how that worked for her. And we don't get to see them enact that, because mostly he plays the sort of Mr. Bennet style bored man who doesn't care what the women in his family do, really. And I would have liked a little bit more time spent on them, although I'm not sure what I would have taken away to create that time. But I wished for a little more of their, maybe more realistic, and especially in contrast with the Bridgertons, right? Here's a family who isn't the Bridgertons in a lot of ways, and this is one of the more meaningful ways in which they are different.
What about you, Tanya?
I agree. Goodness, both of those. I always want more Polly Walker. She's a phenomenal actress. I always want more Polly Walker. And yes, I mean, I did a reread of The Duke and I as well, and just thinking about, it was published in 2000. That scene is even worse in the books and is not necessary to the story. And the book also, the events afterwards are very different from what happens in the show. But you can get the same level of anger and betrayal from both characters without it having to be an assault. They could be emotionally enraged at each other, and that is enough to continue driving the story. So the fact that they left that in, I think is, terrible thing.
I have a question for you. In interviews with Julia Quinn, she's been talking about how attitudes have changed over the past 20 years. And she says, I don't have a direct quote, but she said in basically so many words that when the books were first published, people's sympathies were with Daphne rather than Simon. And then over the years that has changed, and now people are more sympathetic towards Simon. Now, I read this book in maybe 2001 or so. So quite shortly after it was published. And I don't know where she's getting that information from, because I remember reading that scene and I remember thinking, that's terrible. Like, it's because in the book, like you said, it's written a lot worse in the books. And it's very clearly rape. Like, it's not even like, oh yeah, like she does something. No. It's like he's blackout drunk. She takes advantage of him. Like, that's a complete, like, crossing of boundaries. But also, like, I don't know where she's getting this feeling that people were more upset at Simon back in the day, because we didn't have social media or anything back then. So were people writing blogs about, like, how they were Team Daphne? Like, how do you remember this? Like, do you remember reading it for the first time and thinking, well, yeah, Simon's the bad guy in the situation?
I remember reading and saying, this didn't need to happen.
Right.
Like, why is it in here? Daphne has a great line before the scene, I believe, where she's yelling at Simon, you think you're protecting yourself. You think you're doing something noble, but your life is being led by your father from the grave. And when we're in bed together, your father is always with us. That's enough. You don't need to take it further.
Yeah.
Right?
That was another thing, like they have, like, in the series, what they show is that Daphne and Simon have that scene in bed, and then she confronts him and says, like, oh, you were lying to me. But in the books, they have that confrontation earlier, and it's entirely unnecessary afterwards for her to do what she does. So it's just one bad decision after another.
Absolutely. And again, one bad decision, and it could have been completely changed in the shows. It didn't need in the show. It didn't need to be here. So that's a huge disappointment for me. I think that's a very bad choice. And another thing that I'm disappointed at is Penelope's character.
Oh.
I feel like so much of what we get from Penelope is about her love of Colin and her proximity to Eloise, but we don't get a sense of Penelope the person beyond those two things. So when we get to the final reveal of Whistledown, it feels like her? Versus, that makes sense. She's so smart. She's so observant. She's someone who does have a pulse on the society. So I felt like it was a little bit of a letdown for Penelope's character overall.
That's so interesting, because this here is a Nicola Coughlan stan podcast, right?
Yeah. No, I love her. I wanted more.
We love her. She's absolutely my favorite actor on the show. She does such a great job, but I'd never thought about that, but I certainly don't disagree with you.
I think I agree with Tanya, but also I think that the way the show is structured, with the reveal at the end about her being Whistledown, I think they needed to write it that way, because then she is basically a nothing character, like she's not an active participant, she's more of a reactive participant, as Tanya was saying. And then in perhaps the last 10 minutes of the last episode, you see everything completely change. Because for me, it was that scene, like on the rewatch, it was the scene where Colin has left for Greece, and Eloise is comforting Penelope in her bedroom across the square, and her father's dead, and Penelope is crying, and then she composes herself, and then turns to Eloise and says, so tell me about Lady Whistledown, like, were you able to warn her? And Eloise is, like, explaining to her that, yes, I went and I interrupted the Bow Street Runner, like, blah, blah. And then it cuts to Penelope in the carriage with that look on her face. And it's a complete turnaround to everything that we know about Penelope up to that point. And I think, like, the fact that she didn't have a deeper role in the series up till then really played to that to that moment, and it allowed it to be more shocking than perhaps it would have been if we had been a bit more foreshadowy earlier in the series. I think like one of my least favorite scenes from the series was Anthony's introduction in the first episode. I did not like the fact that we first see his butt, and I did not like the fact that he was having sex with Sienna in the park. I don't like the way that Anthony treats Sienna all throughout the series.
Yeah.
But that particular scene I felt like really set the tone for the relationship between the two of them, where he honestly, like, doesn't care about whether, how she might be perceived or who might find her or anything about her dignity or about her. It's not like a fun little escapade. It's daylight, it's the middle of a park with his groom standing right there. I mean, it's pretty gross.
And he's missing his sister's party. He's missing the debut, right?
Right.
It does work really well to forecast. This show is not going to back away from sex.
Yeah.
At least in some significant ways, especially in contrast to other, Regency set shows. So it serves a function. And it also really is quite consistent, like you said, of Anthony, because later on, Sienna says, well, it's fine for you to do that, but it's not fine for me. And that's exactly what we see from the get-go. Although also at times she seems to be an incredibly willing participant, right? I don't ever get the sense that Anthony has forced anything on Sienna.
Right.
Do you?
No.
And she'll sit in her dressing room and ask the other person who works at the opera, are there any men out there for me? She's perfectly blatant about that.
Or Will's exhibition where they find each other under the stands. Well, I am curious, Amrita, as you have read the books, how do you think Anthony's redemption is going to go? Do you feel like he is at a point where he can be redeemed?
Yeah, I've had this discussion with so many different people, and I think I've had it with Beth as well. Anthony in the books is not this person. He's a much nicer brother, and he is a lot more consumed by thoughts of his mortality than he is in this particular adaptation, where he's just a man-child trying to run away from his responsibilities for most of the time, and he's selfish, and he is blinkered, and he is just an enormously privileged wanker throughout most of it. And I really, really hope that in the second season, which is going to be his story, they're able to flesh that out a little bit, and they're able to maybe show that he's acting out in ways, because he doesn't know how to handle his emotions, because that's the type, right? In historical romance, you have the man who doesn't really know how to handle his emotions and therefore just acts out. So that would be a trope, I guess, that they would go. Do you have any idea about where they might be headed with his character?
I about halfway through the season, I was like, that's it. I hate Anthony. There's nothing they can do to redeem him. This is terrible. And I haven't really backed off of that stance. I still feel that he's kind of irredeemable. But I also think that it's so much less interesting to me as a viewer to have his backstory be, I had my heart broken, and now I'm going to be a better person.
Yeah.
Versus the backstory that he gets in the books, which is so much more about his mortality and the responsibilities that he's bearing. So I'm nervous. I'll say that. I'm nervous.
Yeah, there's like a whole bunch of stuff that's coming up in the second season. But I'm hoping that the family scenes might redeem it.
Right. I hope there'll be some interesting us getting to see Penelope be Lady Whistledown as well.
Yeah. Just to wrap things up, so we've talked about how this is an amazing adaptation for a romance series, and how everyone's clearly put in the time and the effort and the dollars. Beth, would you like to see more romances adapted to screen?
Yes, with the caveat that for me, one of the ways to make me more excited about something is to set it in the past. So I would definitely love more, and I would gravitate personally towards the ones set in different time periods. And I don't care where in the world, historical anything is the way to get me excited, regardless of other factors. And that has led me to some really terrible shows, to be sure. Like, that's not enough, but it makes me excited about things. So, if anyone's going to take on another major romance series, my vote would be for something historical, although maybe not, not Regency necessarily, because we do have a lot of those in general. Regency set things in general. It'd be fun to choose something else and somewhere else in the world, because Britain is well covered in this regard.
That is true. That is very true.
That's one thing I really loved about Miss Fisher's murder mysteries. I'm not going to say that Australia doesn't make things about it set in its own history, but I had not seen very many of them. And so that, that was really, just the setting of that was really fascinating, in addition to having such a fun set of characters and everything.
And Tanya, as a romance reader, or I would ask you if, you'd like to see more romance on screen, because obviously you do.
I do, absolutely.
Do.
Yes. Give it to me, please.
So what I'm going to ask you instead is, what are your hopes for further adaptations? Like, do you want, a particular author? Are you hoping for a particular time period? Or do you want to have, like, more realism? Do you want to have more sex, less sex? Like, what are you thinking?
Oh goodness, there's so many great series that are just ripe for fantastic adaptations. I think, oh goodness, I mean, as Beth was saying, there's so many that are set in Britain. There's so many that are in London, around the Regency or Victorian period. It would be nice to pull back from those a little bit, even though those are the ones I probably enjoy reading the most. But there are also some, fabulous ones written, historical romance and series set in the United States. There are romance novels set in made-up countries that I think could also, that opens up that lens for total fictionalization. Alyssa Cole has some fantastic series that I'd love to see. Beverly Jenkins has fantastic series. I'd love to see those adapted. And those are both African-American women authors. And so that would also be an interesting contrast to picking a white author from 2000 to adapt. But then there are also, like, urban fantasy. Why aren't we doing urban fantasy? Or why aren't we doing, paranormal? Like, that could be really fun too, in a different audience entirely. Supernatural has such a following. Why not take some of that energy and put it towards, like, a Nalini Singh or an Ilona Andrews series? I would love to see that.
Yeah. Every time that we've had, like, something like a vampire series or something, they always try to amp up the fact that it's vampires or whatever. And all the time, the chatter is always about the relationships, and right. It always kills me, because I'm just like, take a hint, look at where the interest lies. Supernatural is basically about these guys dealing with all these different problems in the world, and the entire fandom is about, like, these two committing incest together.
Right. It's the relationships.
And I'm just like, people want romance, people want to see more of that. I don't know why people are so resistant towards adapting any of these things. And you're right, like, and I've been seeing, like, a lot more people talk about steamy romances of late, and they've been talking about, like, like, a lot more people are coming up and saying that they want to see romances with less sex in it. And that's not my preference, but I can see why people would like that. There's definitely a part of me that likes the so-called clean romances, so to speak. And, like, Georgette Hare just came out of copyright. So, like, there's something that people could adapt. I think someone's actually adapting The Grand Sophie, or they've been wanting to do it for a long time. So,
oh my goodness. Wow.
Yeah, that would be great.
I was also thinking, like, have you read KJ Charles, who has a great 1920s series? That would be fascinating.
I mean, I love KJ Charles. Like, yeah, there's so many. And there's so many queer romances that have come up in historical romance over the past few years. And it's literally, it is like, like what Tanya was said at the beginning of this episode, where, like the past 5 years is when the game has really changed. And we've seen a lot of things become mainstream that wouldn't, like, people couldn't have imagined that in 2000, like if like a KJ Charles in the year 2000 would have been incredibly difficult to imagine because we didn't even have that in contemporary romance. So yeah, there's like so many directions for this genre to take, and I'm really excited to see season 2. Even with like all my problems with the series, I might have criticized certain things more than others, but I'm still excited to see season 2 and to see where they take this. And I am also excited to see that the success of this show might lead to other adaptations and hopefully something from the past 5 years, because we can handle a lot more diversity. Okay, Beth, where can people find you?
I am at Beth Loves Bali on Twitter.
And Tanya, where can people find you?
On Twitter at Breakfast Quest.
And you can find me at Amrita IQ on Twitter or at Amrita by the Book on YouTube. And I also co-host the Khandan podcast, which is about Bollywood film. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for the feedback. We've enjoyed having you as an audience, and we've enjoyed having this little project. It's been a surprise and a revelation, and we hope to come back in, oh God, when is it? 2022 is when season 2 is probably going to come out. So we'll probably have season 2 of the Binging Bridgerton podcast then as well. Beth, Tanya, thank you both for joining me today, and it is time for us to go, and we will thank the Duke and Duchess for their hospitality tomorrow morning.